if you go into any transgender community where they are talking amongst themselves and you ask the question, like, prior to transition, am I trans or is it just a fetish? The vast majority of all trans-identified males grapple with that question prior to developing a transgender identity. But they explain this away, saying that, well, I only developed this kink as a coping mechanism because I have repressed my true self.
Welcome back, everyone, to Tell Them For Me, brought to you by Road to Purity. We are super excited. We have a very special guest today, Ray Alex Williams, who is a detransitioner and recent Catholic convert, welcome home, who has found healing and transformation in the fullness of truth that is the Catholic Church. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So what I actually, before I get into your full story, I wanted to touch on, I was kind of looking around through your Substack and different places, and recent convert to the Catholic Church. Was that just this past Easter? Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, it just this past Easter. Yes,
that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, welcome to the Catholic Church.
Thank you.
That's super exciting. But yeah, let's dive in a little bit. So obviously, a lot to unpack just right there. Detransitioner, Catholic convert. Wherever you'd like to start, we'd love to hear kind of from the beginning, time spent as trans, and then to detrans, and then Catholic, and all of the above. Wherever you'd like to start.
Sure, I'll try and give the short version.
Okay.
So I grew up Southern Baptist, and from a very young age, I was a cross-dresser. I was interested in, I had a cross-dressing fetish from a very young age. Like prior to puberty, it started with hosiery and stockings and stuff like this. And so that eventually escalated and got more intense, particularly as I got exposed to pornography. And that eventually led me down the transgender pathway. And also in high school, at this point, I had left my Christian faith. I became a hardcore atheist. I was, into all kinds of psychedelic drugs. I was into Eastern philosophy. I explored all kinds of spiritualities. And I was very anti-Christian. And I just thought Christians were stupid. And then, with the cross-dressing stuff, that all escalated eventually to the point where when I was 28 years old, the paraphilia escalated to the point where I transitioned. And I can explain more and later in the conversation about why it is that the vast majority of trans-identified males who go into transition are motivated through a paraphilia called autogynephilia, which is the male's propensity to be aroused at the thought or image of themselves as a woman. That is the most common causal pathway into the transgender identity for dysphoric males. So okay. I can get into that more, but sure. So I transitioned. At this point, I was still an atheist, and I lived as a transgender woman for 8 years of my life. I had been divorced previously, and actually it was the divorce when she left me. That was what was the impetus that caused me to go down the transgender pathway, because I didn't have any kind of obstacles at the time. I was in grad school at the time studying philosophy. And then so I lived at that lifestyle for 8 years. I eventually had a kind of epiphany of sorts where I kind of eventually realized that I do not want to be a lifelong medical patient, because I was at the point where I was having to decide whether to get permanent surgical interventions. At that point, I had just been on cross-sex hormones. So at this point where it was, with the drug regimen that I was taking, I had to decide whether I wanted to have a surgical intervention. My doctors were recommending this. And I kind of had an epiphany that natural is better. I don't want to be a lifelong medical patient. And also the transgender lifestyle caused so many neurotic problems psychologically, living this kind of double consciousness where, I was very self-conscious of how I was fitting in, how I was being perceived by other people. So I then detransitioned medically and socially. I came back to living as a man. And that process, that detransition process, I got very involved in sort of the political fight against gender ideology, gender identity, transgenderism. And so I started, talking about the dirty secret of the transgender community, which is that this paraphilia, the distorted sexual inclination called autogynephilia, is like the underlying driver behind the vast majority of transgenderism in males in the Western world. So I got involved in that, started a YouTube channel, I started talking about my detransition story. But when I detransitioned, that same underlying cross-dressing fetishism, those intrinsic desires that I had struggled with from a young boy, they all came roaring back, because when I transitioned, the testosterone suppression kind of reduced my libido, and also I became habituated to that sort of stimulus, and so it became less arousing. So, but when I detransitioned, all those same desires came back, and so I was now faced with, like, how do I manage these desires as a man? And sort of the consensus within the community of other, detransitioners or other, gender dysphoric males who had kind of who acknowledged the reality of this paraphilia called autogynephilia, they say that, well, if you just try to repress those desires to never act on them, that's going to lead to psychological problems. And so I started this what's called the integration pathway or approach for managing this, which is basically like, keep the kink in the bedroom. It's okay to indulge it on your own, because you need an outlet for these desires. Otherwise, you're going to drive yourself crazy. But as long as you're not, using female spaces, as long as you're not appropriating womanhood, as long as you're not, taking out into the public world, they say, like, it's fine. You just, have this, kink. So I was, engaged in all sorts of fetishistic, behaviors, porn addiction, all this stuff, which was particularly also fueled by, decades of cannabis addiction, which was, fed into the kink, to like the cross-dressing kink. But then at some point, I basically had a Damascus Road experience where, I was in the middle of one of these degenerate, pornography sessions and, masturbating. And tell me if I'm being too explicit for YouTube or whatever your podcast.
No, you're good. You're good.
Yeah. If anything comes up, we can edit it if we needed to.
Okay.
You're good.
So I had that kind of like, God really pierced my heart, and He said, "You need to cut this out. You need to get right, to get right with God, And at that point, this was back in February of this year, and I just had this strong inclination to get pulled into the Catholic Church, and there's this beautiful cathedral near me. So I just went there and I started going to daily mass, and it's just so transformative what the Catholic Church has done for me, having access to the sacraments and the Eucharist and confession, and it's been so powerful. And it's sort of really given me the strength to repress, because the universal consensus within the transgender community is that repressing these feelings is impossible. They say that you're just going to end up, I'm going to eventually retransition, or I'm going to or that there's no other way to deal with this. You just have to indulge these desires some way or another. Sure. And so I came to the understanding that it is only through the power of Jesus and the transcendent and the graces of God that, I have any, possibility of battling this and overcoming this and repressing these desires. And I should mention that my pathway out of hardcore atheism, where I didn't believe in any kind of God or anything, into Christianity was I got into the New Age. And so the New Age kind of convinced me that there was a spiritual reality. I was in all kinds of occult and esoteric dark stuff. And I was always into meditation and all these things. And so that stuff convinced me that there is a spirituality, that, consciousness is more than the material world. But then I discovered the contemplative tradition within Christianity. But for a while, I was into just like very much like esoteric forms of Christianity that kind of emphasize the mystical and the contemplative side, but don't have any emphasis on the doctrines, on the dogmas, on the orthodoxy, on the belief side. And also because I was a liberal Democrat for my entire life, I was very much strongly pro-gay. And so I really was drawn to these ancient, liturgical Christian traditions, but the Catholic Church's position on homosexuality was just like this final intellectual barrier, because I had this kind of like very liberal consent-based understanding of sexual ethics. So it just seemed impossible to me that like, why would two consenting adults loving each other be wrong?
Sure.
But it was only in grappling with the disordered nature of my own perversions and degeneracy that I realized that like, if I'm asked to be chaste from my intrinsic desires that I've struggled with from a young boy, then, if that's not in alignment with the normative ideal of sexual ethics, then it made sense to me that, this can be a trial, this can be a cross to bear. So therefore, people who have homosexual desires, same-sex attractions, like, it's not this fundamental injustice that they are also called to a life of, lifelong chastity and celibacy. So once I realized that, like, I need to be chaste with my own sexual desires as a sort of heterosexual who's attracted to women, but that attraction becomes perverted so that you're attracted to the feminine in yourself. So it's not just you're attracted to femininity in women, but you're attracted to yourself being feminine. So once I realized that, like, I had my own, call to celibacy with regards to these desires, I realized that, like, the church's teaching on sexual ethics was true, and that was the final intellectual barrier. And then I just, and then the rest is history. And now I'm like, full blown Catholic, and I'm so happy to be Catholic, and it's just been wonderful. And I've received so many graces, and it's been transformative to my life. So I'll stop there. I'm sure there's questions.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, and thank you for being vulnerable and sharing, all of the details. I know that may not always be easy to kind of go through your history. It's something though that you're commenting on, making sure you're not getting into too much, but that's something we're very familiar with, very comfortable with. I don't know how familiar you are with our background, but we most of our organization's history up until recently has been primarily dealing with individuals struggling with disordered sexual desires, with pornography, masturbation, all of the above, full-blown sex addiction, different fetishes, whatever it may be.
That's my background.
Yeah, he's got a pretty decent background in just sex addiction in general, and most of our organization has been born out of that, and that's what we started a lot of this podcast on. So totally fine to talk about pretty much everything. You're good there. I have a few different questions, but was there something you wanted to start with?
I mean, I have a lot of questions and thoughts, but it goes down a whole like identity and healing and counseling kind of direction that I don't know
if we have time for.
Can do that.
Well, maybe we can touch on it.
It's almost something. It's more of something. Private? If you would be interested in having a private conversation outside of this.
Well, I think I know what you might ask, and I'll get to it in a minute. So I'm curious, just going through the story, just kind of unpacking everything you just went through. Some small things that I'm just curious about. You kind of mentioned that so it sounds like, the disorder that you specifically described, and how exactly do you pronounce it?
It's called autogynephilia, which means love of oneself as a woman.
As a woman. Okay.
Yeah. So autogynephilia. Like,
and I think you mentioned it now, and I think I read it in one of your Substack articles or posts that, it's more specifically the arousal of picturing yourself as a woman. Is that correct?
Yes, there's different components of it. So there's different subtypes of autogynephilia. For some, their arousal at the thought or image of themselves as a woman is entirely connected to transvestism. So they get aroused in wearing women's clothing. So it's more clothing based. For others, they get aroused at the thought of having like female genitals. So these are the ones who go on to get bottom surgery. And there's, some who get aroused at the thought of like menstruating or different, physiological functions of femaleness. So there's different subtypes. Some autogynephiles have all of these. Some have only a subset. And depending on where you fall in the different subtypes, and also it comes in degrees of variety. So there are some men who just have like this in a very mild degree, and so that just kind of manifests and maybe like they watch transgender pornography or something like this, or because there's also a subtype where you're not just attracted to females and you're aroused at the thought of being a female, but you're attracted specifically to transgender women and you're aroused at the thought of also being a transgender woman.
Okay.
So, and that was particularly in my case when I was a young boy, a teenager. I stumbled upon transgender pornography, and that really imprinted on my brain as like this primary sexuality that was just became like this fetish I had for so many years. It was like my preferred erotic material. And so the phenomenon is very diverse and comes in many different flavors, and also paraphilias cluster and correlate. So if you have this particular paraphilia, you're more likely to have other paraphilias. This is why transgender women are often, very much associated with all kinds of, weird kinks and stuff like this.
Sure. Okay.
So,
that makes a lot of sense. I was kind of going down a different path, but quick side note. You mentioned kind of being exposed to transgender pornography as a young boy. Was that your first exposure to sexuality at all?
No, I mean, my first exposure was like, my friend's dad had like, Playboy magazines, or we would find some, dirty magazines in the woods or something, and just like little, dial-up modem, kind of like, downloading, typing things into search engines as a young boy. So I grew up with like, the early 90s internet. And so, but yeah, that was sort of my first exposure was like, softcore porn and like magazines and stuff.
Gotcha. Okay. So going back for a minute, the autogynephilia, am I saying that right?
Or you just say AGP. That's kind of like a common.
AGP. Okay.
Yeah.
So how did you know that that's what it was? Was that like a specific diagnosis, or did you kind of learn that on your own through your own research and understanding, or was that a medical?
So the theory has been around since the late 1980s, and it's a pretty well-known theory within the transgender community. But the transgender community basically rejects it as pseudoscientific, as transphobic, because they don't like this idea, because it basically that the mainstream narrative is that trans women are women on the inside. They have female brains. They're a woman trapped in a man's body. They're born this way. They have this innate gender identity. Whereas this theory says that no, you're actually just males with male typical sexuality that has been distorted, and your gender identity, rather than being an innate thing you're born with, it's a downstream byproduct of your disordered sexuality, which obviously runs counter to the mainstream transgender narrative. So when I first got into the transgender lifestyle and started, reading things, and when I first came out as trans, like a lot of transgender women spent a lot of efforts trying to debunk this theory. And so I read a lot of these debunkings. And so I became aware of the theory while I was transgender. And I recognized that there's a basic truth to what it was saying. I just sort of disagreed with like the theoretical implications in regards to whether or not it invalidates me as a transgender person. And so, the trans community, so that's how I first became aware of the theory, was like, oh, this is just like transphobic theory by this transphobic, clinician named Ray Blanchard. And there's some other famous people like Dr. Michael Bailey and I've actually recently interviewed both of these people on my YouTube channel. But when I detransitioned, I started reading the literature, the scientific literature on this phenomenon with a more open mind that was free from the ideological biases of the transgender community. And so I realized that, like, hey, this is actually not pseudoscience. This is real. This is legitimate. There's empirical evidence behind this. And the transgender activists have been engaged in a nasty suppression campaign to get the academics who study this canceled. And so there's like a book written about this activist campaign to cancel an academic who wrote a book on this topic. And so it's been a big part of it's been a very controversial thing for decades, and it's still controversial. But people are getting more and more awareness that this is the underlying root cause of the majority of transgenderism in males, which obviously flies in the face of the whole trans rights movement. They do not like this theory but if you go into any transgender community where they are talking amongst themselves and you ask the question, like, prior to transition, am I trans or is it just a fetish? The vast majority of all trans identified males grapple with that question prior to developing a transgender identity. But they explain this away, saying that, well, I only developed this kink as a coping mechanism because I have repressed my true self. And so the only reason why I'm getting into all this fetish stuff prior to my transgender identification is because I was born with this innate gender identity, and that's being repressed. And the only outlet for that repressed gender identity is kink. But the theory of autogynephilia says, no, the kink comes first and the identity stuff comes later as a subsequent development. So they sort of have all this, sophist and rhetorical moves to try and explain away this phenomenon and say, like, oh, no, that doesn't invalidate us. Or they say, like, females experience this too. This is just regular female psychology, and we just happen to be born in the wrong body, and that's why it's manifesting like this. So there's a lot of clever sophistry to try and like deny this reality.
Interesting. So yeah, and that's actually what I've been kind of wondering, and that would make a lot of sense. Because I've only ever heard the conversation or the submission that I was just born in the wrong body, which I did find always interesting because all the people I saw who would place themselves in that category, everything was still way over sexualized. And it sounds like maybe part of that's like you said, the paraphilia, there's usually multiple. It's not just one. You've got multiple kinks. You've got multiple things going on. But so it sounds like you're saying it seems like for the vast majority, if not all, it actually starts with this sort of this arousal, this whatever you want to call it beforehand. And then there's that confusion that says, well, the reason I'm having this is because I'm actually that my identity is different than what normally most people would think, and I actually need to change who I am in order to kind of fit with this thing that I'm struggling with.
Right.
That's very interesting. I've never heard it that way before.
Yeah. And then the other thing, about like my own story, and also very common among these men who struggle with this issue, is that it's very common to have some type of masculinity wound or attachment wound, or sort of, feeling insecure in your masculinity. A lot of these, men are, autistic and sensitive, and they don't fit in with the other boys. They kind of like, they don't get along with the macho jocks, and they're not as into the rough and tumble. They're more sensitive. And so that, can create this kind of insecurity about not fitting into the male gender role. And so they sort of like, and then that insecurity becomes sexualized, often through,
right,
going through puberty, or, getting exposed to pornography and stuff. And so that masculinity wound becomes sexualized, and then that's how you get turned on by the idea of becoming feminine. because it's sort of like, yeah, I don't know. And there's, this is, I should say this is kind of speculative. There's not a lot of hard evidence for this just because
Sure.
like they've been suppressing this research. So I'm kind of extrapolating from just like my own experience and having like a lot of experience in this community, but there's always, exceptions and, not everyone's going to fit into this exact pattern. But I think that's generally true. A lot of people talk about, being failed males or being failed men, where they sort of like, they don't see any possibility of success, of becoming a successful man according to the standards of what it means in society to be a successful man. So it's like, well, my life would be so much easier if I was a woman. And then they sort of like fantasize that, and the fantasies always have a sexual component, often have a sexual component. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think that's definitely something that we've seen in a lot of other areas. And that brings up a really good point, because I've always wondered, I've never had the chance to interact with too much directly. So it's all been kind of, stuff you see online, on YouTube, on TV, whatever, different people debating, all of that kind of stuff. And I have wondered myself, I'm like, people throw around obviously a lot of toxic masculinity and all that kind of stuff. And personally, I kind of do actually think, I think there's a lot of people on the right, on the conservative side, that think toxic masculinity doesn't exist, which I actually do think there is a form of masculinity that is true, and there is traditional, authentic masculinity. And I think there is a toxic form of that boys don't cry, and toughen up and throw some dirt in it and whatever. And there's obviously aspects to the gender role that I understand why you would say those things, but nevertheless, I have personally wondered, on a broader scale, if we as society had been more accepting of, maybe you're a man, but you have what are considered more traditionally feminine traits or interests or whatever, and we just weren't as harsh as that as a society, could a lot of this confusion have been avoided? And it sounds like, based on what you just said, that, like you said, it's not same for everybody, and a lot of this is not super hard research because so much of it's being suppressed. But it sounds like, conversationally, that maybe that could be partially true.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely getting at something important. And yeah, I do, the sort of the feminists, I've taken the whole toxic masculinity thing like way too far, but there's a sense in which, like, even if the boys you don't get along with were being like toxic or bullies, it's just like, you don't necessarily fit in with them because you're
right.
Young boys, their sort of like status amongst themselves is like how athletic you are, how physical you are, how tough you are. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's like, we're made like that by God. But, God also, put a lot of variety into the world. And so, if you're a little bit more on the sensitive side, particularly AGP is very highly correlated with autism in boys. Mm-hmm. And so autistic boys are generally, they're more nerdy, they're more sensitive, they have higher IQ. And so they just kind of like maybe are more bookish. And so they aren't going to score the status points and get the status amongst their male peers. And so that creates this wound, this attachment wound, where they're not, relating to their male peers, or they may have, insecurity relative to their father. In my own case, my father was very much he was a handyman and good with mechanics and cars and fixing things, like wonderful father. But, I just didn't necessarily relate to him with that sort of mechanical emphasis. And so I kind of have been thinking a lot, introspecting about whether, to some extent, my own insecurity as a man was driven by the fact that I felt, not as much of a man compared to my father. And also a lot of my healing as a detransitioner, kind of like rediscovering what it means to be a man, has been, reconnecting with those men that I used to always feel alienated from, like blue collar men, regular men, just like normal men. And so now I really have come to find my solidarity with my fellow brothers, and especially with the biblical conception of, what it means to be a man, that sort of true sacrificial, model of like, Jesus being like, the ultimate masculine man. He's not, what, Andrew Tate's going to define as like, a masculine man, but that's the true, so that's been really helpful to me as well, realizing that like, what it really means to be a man, and like grounding that in like the Christian conception of that.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. And yeah, I think that's something we commonly have seen in our own experience. That same kind of situation often be the catalyst towards homosexuality. So it's interesting that I think there's some overlap there. But that's exactly, I think, what we were going to ask. What I think we were both thinking was, if you knew of, and it sounds like you do, any particular catalyst that kind of went that direction for you, or wound or whatnot. And it sounds like a lot of it had to do with your father, and that identity as a man, and kind of everything you just unpacked there. That's exactly, I think, what we were both wondering. I would imagine that's probably what you were going to ask.
Yeah, it's kind of generally part of it. I would be curious too, in that relationship with your father, where you look at yourself as not measuring up to the man that he was, and that's what you decided. In that relationship with him, did he was there any support in who you were, or was there any criticism of you not being able to do the things that he did, or expectations that were different than what you felt comfortable with?
I mean, other than, being caught cross-dressing as a young boy, and being, feeling a deep sense of shame about that. And that shame is such a powerful experience for autogynephiles and cross-dressers and trans people. Often they talk about these binge purge cycles of shame, where you sort of, will go through this period where you're cross-dressing and you're binging on your autogynephilia, you're binging on these, fetishistic desires. And then you reach the point of climax, and then suddenly the shame hits, and like the desires melt away, and you just feel like disgusted with yourself. And then you sort of throw all your stuff away, your stash of women's clothing, you throw it all away, and you kind of like recommit to being like, trying to, recommit to being like a masculine man again. And then like slowly, like the urges come back, and they just get into this like this binge purge cycle. So that element of shame, I know I got off track from your question.
No, you're good.
But I can't remember where I was going with that.
I think part of the question is, you mentioned, so it sounds like he wasn't hard on you about it, and you already mentioned that you thought he was a great father.
Right.
But it's interesting what made you feel like what he was doing was not, that you weren't living up to it, or that you had to be like that. If there was no outside pressure for that? Was that all internal?
I mean, I think the other component, and I've seen this a lot, I think, amongst men and younger males, is that I was, my father was a good provider, so he was, working all day long, and I was homeschooled. And so I was, more or less raised by my mother, and my mother is an amazing woman and best mom I could have ever asked for. But a lot of my influence in my life was feminine. And so it wasn't necessarily that my dad was putting these like super strict gender roles on me. And it wasn't that I was like this effeminate sissy boy who was like, getting punished for being, gender nonconforming.
Sure.
Like all my non-conforming behaviors were in the privacy of like the secret cross-dressing that I was doing. But otherwise I was a pretty regular kid. I wasn't like super effeminate, but I think there was like a emotional distance with my father just from the sheer fact that he was working outside the home for most of the day, and I was very close with my mother, and so I think that emotional imbalance, I think is, and also, when I did spend time with my dad, like sometimes he would take me to work with him as a handyman, and I think it's just sort of feeling like, incompetent as a man, like not knowing how to do the things that men are expected to do, like, fix things around the house or understand how a car engine works, or even have interest in like, car engines or cars. I was never interested in that stuff. So that's kind of like my own best. I haven't really been to therapy for this. So like I haven't spent a whole lot of time, deep diving into my childhood, and a lot of this is fuzzy. That's kind of like my best explanation. There's also, interestingly, I think it's, we want to emphasize, like, I think it's common, to emphasize these environmental, childhood experiences and traumas and wounds, but also I think there's truth to the fact that there's a concupiscence here. There's an innate brokenness because there's some evidence that AGP runs in families. It's very common for if a father suffers from this paraphilia, that the son also does. So there might be an underlying genetic component that needs to be triggered. It's kind of like schizophrenia, where like you can have an innate genetic risk factor, and then an environmental trigger. For example, cannabis usage can unlock that potentiality. So it's kind of like a nature and a nurture thing. And so, so I think there could be like some innate concupiscence here, that's original sin. We're all kind of broken. So I don't necessarily want to say that like I don't think we have enough research to know whether it's like entirely on the nurture side or whether there's any kind of like genetic component here. So in terms of like, why did God make me like this, or like, or like, why am I like this? Like, I don't really know. I just think like, some combination of innate concupiscence plus like these environmental, attachment wounds, and plus like the pornography, like really, I think if I had never been exposed to pornography, it would have never escalated. Because that's the other thing about paraphilias is they typically escalate. So once you dabble a little bit, you need to kind of like more and more and more to get the same sort of like excitement. And so the pornography became more and more extreme, and then the cross-dressing got elaborate because, wearing one little tight piece of clothing just wasn't doing it. And so eventually, it just kind of grows and grows and grows until eventually you like full-blown transition. That's very common.
You're defining addiction.
Yeah, it really is. I think
that's something we talk about a lot. That need to, that basic understanding of addiction, the escalation.
The escalation is a very common thing with all forms of addiction, and this is exactly the same thing that we were describing.
Like you get a high, and you need more and more to get the same high.
Right.
They're doing the same thing again won't have the same effect, the same arousal, the same satisfaction.
Right.
And so it has to grow.
I mean, it's the idea is born out of, from what I've heard, as from like heroin or cocaine addiction. It's the first high that you get, and I think they call it chasing the dragon. You're looking for that same high again, and you've got to be more intense, more radical, more risky to continue to chase that, to keep getting it.
Right.
And you never quite get there, but you're always looking for it.
Right. Yeah. And I should mention that, I think I already mentioned this, but, part of like my paraphilia and my sort of, pornography habits and masturbation habits were connected to my cannabis addiction, because I started smoking weed when I was in high school. And, for me, like, cannabis was always like it functioned as an aphrodisiac of some kind. It would enhance all these like, sensations, these sexual sensations. And it made, the pornography, more intense, and all these feelings more intense. And, a lot of, self-abuse, sodomistic self-abuse. That was a big part of like, this kink for a lot of, men is, yeah, so and so part of like my healing process with, with Jesus, what he's healed me from is not just the sexual addiction, it's the cannabis, because they're one and the same. Like my biggest trigger for the kink is the cannabis. It's all interrelated. And, and people don't think that, you can get addicted to weed, but it has that same exact habituation and tolerance and buildup. You need more and more and more. And like, and yeah, it's very much connected, in my mind. And part of it is just like this search for novelty, for sensation seeking, for just craving stimulation.
Right.
And it's just like, I just wanted to kind of like numb myself, or almost like get lost in this kind of like, mind melting, dopamine,
it's another form of escape.
Yeah.
It's a medication. It's all the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense that's connected. So I'm curious, kind of going back to as you're going through your story, and I apologize if I missed this, but it sounded like you kind of hit that point where you just didn't want to be a lifelong medical patient, is kind of, I think, in your words. And so you decided to detransition, but it sounded like shortly thereafter you started speaking out against a lot of this. Is that what I understood?
Yes. So I detransitioned, and then I got into what's called gender critical politics. So there's this whole movement of it's a pretty broad coalition. It's a shared coalition with like conservatives, with like, classical liberals, with, Christians, Catholics, there's a big tent in terms of critiquing gender identity ideology, the modern transgender ideology. And so I was approaching this from the perspective of like more of like a liberal critique of this, where and sort of approaching it from the perspective of like empirical sciences. Like you can just empirically establish that it's false, that, transgender women, it's fair for them to play sports, or, you can talk about certain liberal principles of, violations of men and going into women's spaces and stuff like this. So I had this critique of the ideology from not necessarily a Catholic or Christian perspective, but, more or less aligned on the same things. Like, you can't change your sex. You're born. If you're born a man, that's what you are. And so, and a lot of it was connected to this feminist movement called radical feminism. So there's these, I don't know if you ever heard the term TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminists, which are like, when these women who push back against, these men, invading their female spaces and, coming to female prisons. And so they're critiquing transgender ideology from the framework of like feminism and like liberal principles. And so I had a YouTube channel, and I got active on Twitter and all this stuff. And so I started really pushing back against this gender ideology. And then, and along with that became an entire shift of my political worldview. I was very progressive, very woke, hyper woke on all this sex, gender, intersectional feminism, Black Lives Matter, all the sort of, typical progressive causes. Sure. And so when I detransition, once you start questioning the axiom that transgender women are women, that's like one of the fundamental axioms of the modern progressive movement. Once you start challenging that, if that falls, then like you start questioning all this other stuff too that's connected to the progressive orthodoxy. And so I voted blue my entire life, but the most recent election I voted all red, and I just kind of had this total political shift. And so I started becoming more open to conservatism, but at that point I hadn't really became Catholic. And so
Right.
now I'm very happy, of course, not like, Pope Francis said gender ideology is the most dangerous ideology of our times. And so now I think that the Catholic Church has the best resources to battle this ideology because it's the truth. And there's been this trend amongst other detransitioners who are turning to Catholicism because when you've been sold this lie that you can change your sex, and then you learn that like God made us male and female, and that's like an ontological metaphysical reality that can't be changed. Like it sort of provides a grounding in truth, because so much of the transgender movement is like postmodern and relativistic, and there's no truth. And
Right.
it's just very much like, yeah, it's very postmodern, the whole thing. And so detransitioners, I think, are naturally drawn to, Catholicism and other forms of traditional Christianity, precisely because it grounds our nature as gendered beings in a metaphysical reality that's transcendent and unchanging. And I think that's, it's not just true, it's like comforting when you have spent so many years lost in the delusion that you are, or trying to be this thing that you can't be,
Right. So it sounds like most of your conversion, though, came from research, more or less. I mean, it sounds like you really dug into things and started to kind of see the truth.
Started questioning the validity
that
of what
accurate?
you were believing.
Because I ask because it seems like such a flip to be going, 8 years and then to detransition, and it feels pretty fast turnaround to start going, well, none of this actually makes any sense. And I know you're probably condensing it for like the explanation, but I'm impressed at the flip there.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people say that, like, well, it's funny because I, have done such a radical shift in my worldview, not just politically, but now, in my religious worldview as well. I've had a lot of my critics and people saying that, like, well, you're just going from one extreme to another, or you're just prone to ideological flightiness. And so this Catholic thing is just a phase, and that, you're just attracted to these extreme ideologies because you got sucked into the transgender cult, and now you're being sucked into like the Catholic cult, and you're just, this mentally weak person who's, searching for some sort of emotional crutch to deal with your problems and stuff. It's like a lot of people don't believe, a lot of secular humanists and atheists, they don't believe in the like possibility of radical religious conversion, because they don't believe in miracles. They don't believe in grace. They don't believe that God can come in and transform you, like, St. Paul on the Damascus Road. And so like, and, I don't know what to tell. It's like, it's hard to tell people who non-believers. They just don't get it.
Yeah.
They don't. It's what is it? There's something that says, for those who understand, no explanation is necessary. For those who don't, no explanation is possible.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
Yeah.
And if you suddenly discovered the truth, and that's why this happened so quickly, is the truth made itself apparent to you through grace, through God, through itself. If this is the truth, then what you came from is not the truth. And it's obvious what that is then.
Right.
And what all revolves around it.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Totally agree. And, and all I can do is really pray for these people, pray that they too will experience these graces and they will open their hearts to conversion. Because, because a lot of the trans community, they're very atheistic. They're very anti-Christian. They hate God.
They have to.
Yeah. So it's there's a lot of darkness in that community. So I really feel, I ask myself all the time, like, God, like, why did you bring me down this crazy pathway? Like, why am I 38 years old, twice divorced? And now, I should have mentioned, like, while I was transgender, I met, a woman, we got married, and then, we're now divorced. And part of that was obviously when we met, I was a totally different person. My first marriage was successfully annulled. due to lack of canonical form, she was baptized Catholic. My second marriage, it's in the process of annulment, and we were living a polyamorous lifestyle, so we didn't make lifelong fidelity vows, and it's just so. And also, I was transgender. I was confused. Like, I was very. It was just the relationship was not sanctioned by God, and it was doomed to fail. But that was also part of the process. As when I detransitioned, that kind of like started the end of the relationship, essentially.
Sure, that makes sense. Wow, that's a lot to go through. I'll just say in general that very impressed by how far you've come and everything that you've had to go through. I'm sure a lot of that was a lot of pain and a lot of turmoil. Maybe that led up to a lot of it, and then just living that way for 8 years and having to wrestle with these ideas and go through all of it. And very commendable for you to kind of take a look at all of those things and ultimately allow God to provide those graces and step in. And I'm sure, like you've already mentioned, a lot of the criticism that you receive from detransitioning, from becoming Catholic, he's just going from one extreme to another, all of that kind of stuff. Very, very impressive what you've gone through and what you've overcome. Really, really just amazing stuff.
Well, my confirmation saint is Saint Augustine. Not only because I'm a philosopher, I like theology, but I'm a writer, and the prodigal son story obviously relate to. He's the classic prodigal son conversion story, converted as an adult, but also that Augustinian idea of my heart is restless, Lord, until I rest in you. Like, even when I was an atheist, I was always seeking something, because I was into meditation, contemplation, psychedelics. I was always exploring my consciousness. I was like seeking, and I was like, when I got into the New Age, I explored Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. I studied all the world religions. I practiced every spirituality you can imagine. I was always searching, and then coming home to the Catholic Church, the Catholic faith, like, it's really that restingness in the truth. And to the people who hate the Catholic Church, they think it's just an extreme ideology. They're like, oh yeah, you're just going from one extreme to another. But like, internally, it feels like such rest in the solidity of the eternal truth. And it's like, it's hard to like,
you're done searching.
Yeah, I'm done searching. I've come home, and like I never knew that Catholics tell converts welcome home until I converted. But thinking about that phrase, it's so true. It is so true, and it's like it really is like I'm home spiritually, emotionally, psychologically. It's just been incredible. And, I've had such a positive reception from people in my parish who have heard my story, and, no one's looked at me askance for my, degenerate past. And, everyone's just very, grateful that, God worked his graces in me. And, it's just been wonderful. And, and I love being Catholic. It's like the best thing.
That's awesome. Well, I have so much more that I would actually love to talk about.
I think we could go another hour.
Yeah, we could easily. I mean, that hour went by so fast. You've been so wonderful to talk to. Thank you so much for sharing so much. We are pretty much out of time. I know you have to get going. Yeah. But we would love to have you back. And then before we leave out, did you have any last thoughts?
Not that I can do quickly.
Okay. But well, I have one last question, and then want to let everybody know where they can find you and all of your media and contact info. But I'm just curious. I think something really important that a lot of us need to understand, because I see obviously a lot of the movement and on the left and the right, and conservative and liberal. And I'm always sad, and I see so much on the conservative side sometimes that can be so harmful and so hateful and so just not approach it in the right way. Not everybody, of course, but a lot of the public stuff I see, even though it's technically correct in what they're saying, I still think not really be sensitive to what a lot of people are going through. But I'm just curious if you have any specific thoughts on, to anybody out there listening, especially who's conservative and Catholic and Christian, how do you recommend we approach whether we know somebody individually who is living the transgender lifestyle right now, or the transgender movement as a whole? How would you recommend we approach them?
That is a big question, because a lot of it, there's a question like pronouns, like should a Christian respect, someone's pronouns, and like I sort of come around to the belief that the truth is important, and so now I don't respect people's pronouns. I sort of refer to them based on the chromosome that's traditionally associated with your sex. But I know that's tough. But yeah, I think having compassion, because I think it's tempting to see particularly trans women as these like predatory men who are like causing this societal havoc. And yeah, that's true. There are a lot of like transgender women who are dangerous and perverted and degenerate and causing problems in society, and like causing all these problems. But a lot of these men are very wounded, and so having that Christian love of the enemy, and like having that compassion, realizing that like a lot of these men are broken, and that they have wounds, and that this, even if they are they have this paraphilia and that seems disgusting, or you just feel like this disgust towards them. Like, I think it's important to realize that like internally, psychologically, even if they're not repentant of it, like it's still psychologically a lot of suffering to live with this paraphilia. And so, yes, we should put in protections in society. We should speak the truth, but we should also recognize that like this is still a form of brokenness, and we're all sinners. Right. And so that's kind of what I would say.
So be as loving and compassionate as possible while still respecting the truth. Which of course, I think makes sense, but
bottom line, and as you said so many times, we're broken, we're wounded, and so many things in that nature. And bottom line is, we're all in pain.
Yeah.
If you don't transform your pain, you'll transmit it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's that absolutely
simple. And I think that's actually a point I really want to touch on and make sure for everybody to hear is that, I don't want to get this conversation and feel like it's isolated somehow to individuals struggling with transgender, lifestyle, AGP, all that kind of stuff. We're all human. We're all children of God who have pain and woundedness, and that manifests in different ways. And we all deserve love and respect, but also respecting the truth. So just to recognize that importantly, that, I think that shared common humanity and struggle in life, I think can also be helpful, at least for me. It's just showing in a different way. Yeah. But yeah, we are out of time, unfortunately. Again, would love to have you back and talk more. Last thing, where can people find you?
So I'm pretty easy. My Substack, rayoxwilliams.com, my YouTube, search for Ray Ox Williams, and my Twitter, Ray Ox Williams. So yeah, that's where I'm at: Twitter, Substack, and YouTube.
Awesome. And of course, we'll include all of those in the description as well with links. But thank you so much again for joining us. And to everybody out there, God bless and have a great day. Thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed our podcast. If you have any topics you'd like us to discuss in future episodes, shoot us an email at ask@roadtopurity.com. Don't forget to visit our website, roadtopurity.com, for all our free resources and affordable programs to help men and women who are looking to grow in sexual purity. We rely on donations to keep doing what we do, so if you'd like to support Road to Purity, please consider donating at roadtopurity.com/donate. Thanks again for your support. God bless.